Hi, welcome. We'll get started in just a minute. I'm going to let folks trickle in. All right, welcome everybody to today's free prep hour. My name is Allie Bell, and I'll be your instructor. I'm happy to be here with you. We're going to start with some introduction. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself, and I'd love to hear a little bit about all of you. So I have been an LSAT instructor with Manhattan Prep for about 10 years now. I also teach the GMAT. And in the past, I was a school teacher. So I taught middle school history and English for a long time. And currently I work as the manager of training programs and an instructor manager at Manhattan Prep. And I live in Oakland, California. I'd love to hear a little bit about what brings all of you to our workshop today. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourselves in the chat. So I'll start the chat and you should see a blinking orange somewhere, or if you're joining from an iPhone or an iPad, if you click the More button, you'll see the chat. And I'll ask you to share a few things in the chat and I'll type them out. If you wouldn't mind sharing your name, where you're joining from, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your LSAT studies so far. So for example, when are you taking the test? Did you just start studying, or are you kind of midway through your test journey or getting closer to the end? So I'll put those questions in the chat and I'd love to hear from you. I'll just pause a moment. Thanks for letting me know, Tiara. No worries about the microphone. Most of our participation today will be through the chat anyways, and I'll be actively monitoring it. If anyone wants to, participate through the microphone, you can raise your hand and I can call on you so that you'll be able to speak. But shouldn't be a problem if you don't have audio. Juliana, nice to meet you. Love to hear where you're from and when you're planning to take the test. When did you start studying? Type the questions up on the screen too. So, name, where are you? And what's your LSAT story? When did you start studying? When are you planning to take the test? Hi, Arian. If I'm pronouncing names correctly. Okay, welcome from New York. Awesome. Welcome, Tiara from Louisville. Okay, yeah, a lot of folks choose to retake the LSAT. So glad to hear that that is on the table for you. And that we've got a good amount of time to get ready. Okay. Well, as I wait for other folks to introduce themselves, we'll go ahead and get started. Hi, Juliana. Thank you for the introduction. Awesome. Okay. So first, if you're participating today, you might be in search of some other free prep options. So I wanted to share a couple with you that you can find on our website. Hi, Jolene, welcome. Thank you for the introduction, another California, that's great. So two great ways that you can get a little bit of free LSAT prep. First is to try one of our live classes. We offer 10-session LSAT courses. Each session is 3 hours and the courses are comprehensive. We allow students to sit in on the first session for free. And that session offers a great introduction to logic games and logical reasoning. So it's 3 hours of excellent LSAT content. And there's no pressure to join. And we also have an interactive on-demand course that features one of our LSAT instructors teaching the curriculum, but it's through a video format that's adaptive. So it changes the output that you receive based on how you're performing on the questions. And I hear from students that they find it hilarious and really helpful. As one of our legendary teachers, Noah, who leads most of the instruction. And you can try a sample of that for free on our website. So if you're interested, check out some of those resources. So today we are going to spend some time working on reading comprehension. And reading comprehension is an increasingly important component of the LSAT now that we are experiencing a prolonged version of the LSAT Flex. And now the reading comprehension section, which used to be just a quarter of your score, is now a third of what you're going to see on the test. So each of those reading comp passages is especially important. And today we're going to focus on a particular type of reading comprehension passage that's called the comparative passage. Before I get too deep into what this is and how to approach it, I'd love to hear from you in the chat. What do you know already about comparative passages? This could include anything from approaches that you've learned, or just how you would describe what they're doing, what they're testing, how many there are. All right. Not very much is perfectly fine. Yeah, Arian, that's a great point. Comparative passages are relatively new. They didn't start showing up on the LSAT until the June 2007 exam. And that's really important to know because it means that when you're doing practice from real LSAT practice tests, you want to make sure that you get enough practice in that has the comparative passages that came after 2007. So that's something to keep in mind if you're looking back at some of the older tests, is that they might not have, or they won't have those comparative passages, so they won't quite give you realistic practice. Cool. Anything else that we know about these? Okay. So a couple of things that I'll add. There is one comparative passage per reading comprehension section. And what we mean when we say a comparative passage is that the passage actually has two different authors, and each author writes a shorter passage. So you'll have a passage A and a passage B. And those two passages are going to be in some way related to each other. Oftentimes they'll center around a central theme or topic. And that's about all that we know before we dive into a comparative passage. So we don't necessarily know, for example, if those two passages are going to be a debate where author A is arguing against author B. But we do know that there will be some kind of link either in terms of the subject matter or the argument that's being made. Comparative passages in many ways test a lot of the same reading skills that all reading comp passages test, but they also have some unique elements and skills that are required for them. So what we're going to do today is talk a little bit first about the general process for reading comprehension and how we might tweak that to approach a comparative passage successfully. Then we're going to actually try a comparative passage from a real LSAT test. This is going to be from practice test 65, and do some questions for that passage. And then finally, in the last few minutes, we'll take some time for questions about comparative passages, reading comp, or the LSAT in general. So let's start by talking about approaches to reading comprehension. If you are still refining your approach to a reading comprehension passage on the LSAT, I think it's really helpful to think about what is important when you're reading a passage and what is less important. The reason that that's so helpful is that these passages are dense and highly academic, and they're passages that might take an expert in the subject matter quite a bit of time to read and fully digest in a way that would allow them to remember everything in the passage. Most of us aren't going to be experts on everything we read on the LSAT, and we also don't have unlimited time. We have maybe 2.5 to 3.5 minutes, ideally, to read a passage and allow ourselves time for the questions. And because of that, we want to maximize what we get out of that read in a way that will be the most beneficial to us when we get to the questions. So there are a few things that I prioritize when I'm reading any reading comprehension passage. The first is what I think of as the scale, which is just what are the two major perspectives that are discussed in this passage. And often those two perspectives will center around how to answer a single question. So for example, just a very simple example, we might have an LSAT passage where they're presenting perspectives on the question of how tomatoes, should be categorized. Some say they should be a fruit, some consider them to be a vegetable. The other thing that I want to pay attention to as I'm reading is how the author goes about presenting those perspectives. And in particular, how do they map out in terms of the structure of the passage? So where does the author present each perspective? And which perspective does the author seem to agree with? And this is what I think of as the passage map, which basically means that in my head, I have a clear sense of what each paragraph does in the context of this overall argument, in the context of this overall scale, and also a little sense of what the content was. What did the paragraph actually say about the topic? So a pretty classic structure would be for the first paragraph to kind of introduce the topic, provide a little bit of background information. So here you can see this passage map says it introduces the question, and then the actual content suggests the author believes it's actually a vegetable. Then we have a switch into counter evidence and the author presenting their side of the debate. The author shares a different perspective, but then jumps in with their opinion on it. And then finally, a full paragraph on the author's opinion and examples of why. And what I want to have walking out of the passage is possibly this written down in a shortened format, but most importantly, this in my head. I know that paragraph 2 was where I saw counter examples about tomatoes as a fruit. And paragraph 3 is where I'm going to look if I'm asked about the author's opinion. And paragraph 1 is where I'm going to look if they want to ask me about that background information. Sometimes it can be helpful also to note just how much of the passage is devoted to each perspective. And we represent that on the scale in terms of the tilt. So the more tilted the scale is towards one side, the more time was spent talking about that perspective. So what I want to do is think about what a scale or a passage map might look like if you have not one passage to consider, but two in the context of a comparative passage. So when we have a comparative passage, a lot of times I would say what people expect is that they're going to have an A versus B debate, like you see in this top example. So maybe we have the same central question of how to categorize tomatoes. And in the first passage, author A says they are a fruit. And in the second passage, author B says they are a vegetable. And there's just this debate going on. That happens less often than you would expect in comparative passages. And that's primarily to make things a little harder for us. The LSAT doesn't want to give us the obvious relationship between the two passages. They want to make us work for it a little bit more. So some of the relationships that you might actually see instead when you are reading comparative passages are going to be shown on the next couple of examples. So here first, you might actually see that both authors of the two different passages pretty much agree with each other. So in this case, they both agree that the tomatoes are vegetables, but they'll probably present a somewhat different angle or different set of evidence on why the tomatoes are considered to be vegetables. Another thing that you might see is that only one of the authors directly addresses this argumentative question, and the other author provides background information. It's kind of like when you're looking at the difference between a persuasive essay and an expository or informational essay. So one person is out to make a point, tomatoes are a vegetable, and then maybe author A is just like, here is the history of tomatoes, or here's the history of the debate, but doesn't actually weigh in. So when we read a set of comparative passages, our ultimate goal is not to make two different scales, but to think about how the two passages connect to each other to address one central question, and how the two authors relate to each other in terms of that central question. So you'll pay attention as you're reading the passages to whether they seem to be generally in agreement with each other. Perhaps the scope of one of their arguments is broader and the scope of the other argument is narrower. Perhaps they're discussing it from the lens of different fields. One is an agricultural scientist and one is a expert on consumer habits. So you want to pay attention to both what is the overarching question or argument being discussed, and then also what are the subtleties of how each author approaches that particular perspective. In terms of writing things down, many people do find it helpful to take some notes during reading comprehension. You will be able to use scratch paper if you end up taking the LSAT Flex. So you can take some notes. You can also highlight directly on the screen if you would prefer. The thing that you want to be mindful of is the balance between the amount of time that you spend writing things in your notes and how helpful your notes are in terms of comprehending the material. So what I encourage you to think about is that these notes are really a comprehension tool more than a reference tool. Most people are not going to benefit a ton from trying to answer all of the questions by looking at their careful, neatly written, sentence-long notes about the passage. Instead, the benefit most people get out of notes is that it forces them to stop and think in periodic intervals while they read. It forces them to digest and commit to paper what they have just read. So to that end, I encourage you to focus, excuse me, primarily on making sure that your notes are putting things into your own words, are attaching labels to paragraphs to say, this is where I found the author's opinion. This is where I found an example. This is where I found context, rather than trying to copy keywords or write down everything that the passage says. And also to focus more on how it's helping your brain think and less on how beautiful it looks on your paper, because we just don't have a lot of time to make those notes beautiful. So in just a moment, I'm going to give you a passage so that you'll have the opportunity to try some of these strategies out. I'd like to pause for a second, though, to see if there are any questions. So if you have a question about the general reading process or what to expect from these passages, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. Okay, not seeing any questions right now. I'll keep my eyes on the chat if something comes up. But I'm going to go ahead and put a passage on the screen. Again, this passage is from Prep Test 65, so it's a real LSAT passage, and it's going to be passage 3. I'll give you about 3.5 minutes to read the passage, and I encourage you to experiment with your note-taking as you read this passage. When you're done, we're going to discuss together what the scale for this passage might look like. So here is the passage, and I'm going to hop off camera, but I'll be right here, so reach out in the chat if you need anything. Again, you have 3.5 minutes. All right, that is 3.5 minutes. So I'm gonna work with you all to build a scale for this in just a minute. But first, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you noticed about this passage. So I'm gonna start by asking you to share in the chat, and I'll type it over here off to the side. What strategy or strategies did you use while you were working through this passage? So for example, did you take notes? Did you make a passage map? Did you make a scale in your head? Did you pay attention to similarities and differences? Did you use any strategies like rereading or skimming? So take a moment and use the chat to tell me a strategy that you used. Thanks, Tiara. So Tiara mentioned taking a couple of notes about the main purpose and rereading. I like the language of a couple of notes because it suggests that you're being intentional and thoughtful about when and how to write those notes down, which is going to be more useful than writing down everything that jumps out at you. Juliana took notes as well. Cool, thanks. Keep them coming if you'd like. As we start to build the scale for this passage, I think a really helpful starting point is to think about similarities and differences. So I'm going to ask you as we get the last couple of responses in here to think about what did you notice as similarities in passage A and passage B. And we'll start with that. Nikki, that's really interesting. So took a few notes and made a scale in your head. That's awesome. Thank you. So let's use the chat now. Can you share any similarities that you noticed between the two passages? Great, thanks, Tiara. So they both expressed an opinion. That's important because it helps us to describe that scale. What else? What was similar about the content? Good. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of folks point out the central theme here is an analysis of legality of blackmail. What makes it legal or illegal? And Arian, that's an interesting point to say they are both against blackmail. Certainly neither of them seems like they think blackmail is a good thing, right? But I think they go even further beyond that to explore what is the sort of legal theory on why blackmail is problematic. Why is it enough of an issue that we should punish people for it through the legal system? What do you notice about differences between the two passages? Again, you can tell me in the chat. Okay, good. Juliana is saying one of them spoke on common law and in particular Canadian and US common law, and the other is focused on classical Roman law. So that's an important distinction. What other differences did you notice? Did we find that Canadian and US law treat blackmail the same way as Roman law? Okay, let's see if we can articulate how they're different. What is different about the way Canadian and US law treats blackmail versus Roman law? And if you aren't sure, I'll point you towards a couple of places where I think you might be able to draw the distinction. So the starting point of each paragraph, these opening sentences, I think are pretty helpful. So I'll highlight them in yellow. What I noticed here is that in passage A, we're told that blackmail is a major crime. It's very unique, but nobody has clearly explained why it should be illegal. And then passage B is saying, and actually in Roman law, there was no special category for it. So it's kind of the opposite. It wasn't considered this special, unique crime. It didn't need to be because it fit within this broader system that was used for determining whether something should be considered legal or illegal, that based on whether the action caused harm, not just what the action was. So there's an interesting distinction between these two, in that they're saying in the one case in US law, there's kind of this lack of a theory for explaining why blackmail should be a crime. And in passage B, they're saying, well, it wasn't itself a crime, but the broader theory was so encompassing that it ended up being a crime because there was this explanation of if it's an action that causes harm, it would be considered a crime. And that's one of the things that we want to pay attention to when we're looking at the perspectives in these comparative passages, is what are the different scopes of each of the arguments, and what is the different sort of theoretical framework behind each of these different arguments. So if I'm building a scale for these two passages, I might put forth as a central question something like, how do legal systems handle blackmail? And we have clearly identified that we've got in passage A, a description of how the US and Canada common law handles blackmail. And in passage B, we've got a description of how Roman classical law handled blackmail. And we've got this commonality in the sense that they both ultimately seem to generally decide that, there's often a criminal outcome. There's often some sort of criminal consequence. But the reasoning that's used to arrive at that criminal consequence is very different. In Roman classical law, there is no specific category for blackmail. Instead, there's a broad system that's based on how much harm comes out of an action. And that broad system often results in blackmail being a crime. Whereas in US and Canadian law, blackmail is a crime up front by definition, but there's sort of more of a lack of a theoretical explanation for why. So it's almost like the Roman system has the why, but not the specific category for the crime. And the US and Canadian law has the category, but not the why for the crime. Let me pause there for a moment. Let me know if you have any questions about this process of coming up with a scale for both passages. Okay. One thing that I'll emphasize is that while we may not have time on the test to actually set and write out an entire scale for a comparative set, I do think that it's even more important on this particular type of passage than any other passage to pause at the end of your reading and think about the connections and differences between the two passages. And that will often prepare you really well for the questions. It's really easy to just finish passage B and go straight into the questions with all of the stuff from passage B fresh in your head. But you know that a lot of the work in the questions is going to be analyzing how these two passages relate to each other. So it's really helpful if you do a little bit of that work up front before you start to be prejudiced by the answer choices that you're given. So with that, I'd love to give you a little bit of a sense of what types of questions you're going to experience on comparative passages. Just like standard passages, some questions on comparative passages are going to be straightforward questions that are just about one passage. So they might say, which of the following of answers would the author of passage A? agree with? Or which of the following is stated in passage B? And for those types of questions, you'd approach them exactly the same way that you would approach them on a standard reading comp passage. But we're going to focus on in this session are the question types that are unique to comparative passages, which are questions that focus on overlaps and contrasts between the two passages. So questions where you need to think about the connections and the differences between these two. So let's start by taking a look at one. This will be a little bit smaller because I wanted you to be able to see the question as well as the text. But this is a real question down here. Again, this is from Prep Test 65, question number 14, if you want to look it up later. And I'm going to give you about a minute to read this question and consider your answer. And then I'll put out a poll once that minute is up so that you can share what answer you picked. All right, that's about a minute. So I'm going to launch a poll and ask you to just input what answer you would pick if you were to pick right now. Okay, thanks everybody for voting. So the two answers I see that most people selected were either answer choice C or answer choice D. This question is an example of an overlap question. So we're asked for something that is not just mentioned in each passage, but that is the central topic of each passage. Overlap questions that are focused on big ideas like this are great ones for you to make a mental prediction or pre-phrase before you look at the answer choices. So coming into this question, rather than dive right into the answers, I would pause for a moment and say to myself, okay, what did I see as the common central topic of each of these passages? And on the example where we were working on the scale, we had talked about how the central theme was how blackmail is handled in two different legal systems, or really three, the US legal system, Canada's, and the Roman classical legal system. And so that might be my prediction going in. And conveniently for me, if I made that prediction, it matches up really well with answer choice C, which does end up being the correct answer. But there are some tempting incorrect answers here as well. So let's take a look at them and see if we can figure out why they're wrong, starting with answer choice D. So answer choice D certainly looks promising because it's got two of the key terms showing up that we're looking for here, blackmail and legal. The word that I would have the most questions about when I look at this is the history of blackmail as a legal concept. So I'd want to check do each of these passages make their focus on telling the history, so the story over time of how Black male came to be the legal concept that it is? And it's certainly tempting to say yes to that, because both of these passages provide an explanation for why Black male is, treated the way it is in that given society. But if you look at, for example, the structure of passage A, it really isn't telling a chronological story. It's describing the problem with the way that Black male is treated, and outlining the consequences of not having a successful theory, and then suggesting a way to write a successful theory. So it's not really saying, when we first thought about Black male, here's where this idea came from, and here's why it became a crime. It's not really going through the story. And actually, if I can find that this is not the central topic of at least one of the passages, that's enough for me to eliminate an answer, because this is an overlap. The most common way that an answer choice will be incorrect on these overlap questions is that they only focus on one or the other passages. So some of these answers I can eliminate pretty quickly. For example, answer choice A, I know triangular transactions were only mentioned in passage A. Answer choice E, I know that the lack of an explanation was primarily passage A. Answer choice B is an example of one that just doesn't quite match the scope of either passage. It doesn't even mention the word Black male, which we identified as the central concept, and instead focuses on free speech. So I would eliminate that one as well. So again, the correct answer to this question is C. And I'll pause for a moment for you to let me know if you have any questions or anything you'd like to hear further explained. You can tell me in the chat or raise your hand. So let's try another question for this passage. Here it is, and I'll be back in a minute. All right, that's about a minute and a half. I will launch another poll. You can let me know what answer you're leaning towards. All right, thanks. So this is a pretty tough question, and I think that's reflected in the answers that we got. I see 4 different answers that have been chosen here. So my approach to a question like this would definitely be to focus on process of elimination and to be really careful about the way this question is worded. So I'm looking for something that is true of Canadian and US common law about blackmail, but not about Roman blackmail. And I'm going to start by walking through these and seeing if I can eliminate any based off of just this initial big picture read that I've got. So answer choice A, it combines 2 acts that are each legal separately. My first gut check is just, do I remember passage A saying that? And I do remember that that was in the first paragraph. So I'm going to keep that for now. B, it is a transaction with a triangular structure. I do remember passage A talking about that, so I'll keep it for now. C, the laws pertaining to it are meant to be enforced precisely as written. This one I remember passage A actually contradicting. There's a part of passage A where it says most blackmail statutes rely on the good judgment of prosecutors not to enforce relevant statutes precisely as written. This is an example of a contradicted answer choice, which is surprisingly tempting on reading prompt because it often uses almost entirely the exact same language as the passage, but it changes one little word. And in this case, that word is the word not. So our brains say, hey, I remembered reading that in passage A, and we might miss this detail that passage A said that was not true. D, the blackmail victim pays to avoid being harmed by persons other than the blackmailer. That's one that I would probably want to go back and look at. It does talk about third party. E, Canadian and US common law have no special category pertaining to blackmail. This one, like many of you, I would cross out right away because it doesn't have any pertinence to passage B at all. So passage B wouldn't have any claim to whether anything is true about Canadian and US law, since it only focuses on Roman law. So let's take a look at these remaining answer choices. I'm going to go ahead and tell you that the correct answer is answer choice A. And I'm going to give you a moment just to reflect on that, and then we'll debrief in the chat. So take a moment and see if you can find the evidence for why A is correct and the evidence for why B or D is incorrect. And if you have an explanation, go ahead and put it in the chat. I'd love to hear your thoughts about why is A correct? Why are B or D incorrect? Yeah, it's the worst when we're down at 2, but the most important thing is to learn from those mistakes. Appreciate you sharing that. So if I'm looking at A, I know that it clearly stated in this first paragraph that each of these is legally permissible separately. Tiara, great. I'd love to hear why it's A. Yeah, that's perfect. So if we look at passage B, passage B makes it clear that because Romans had sort of a totally different way of considering whether an action should be considered illegal, it's based on the consequences and not on the action itself. And so, you know, the question is, would each of these acts revealing embarrassing information and asking for money, would they both be legal under Roman law? And the rest of the passage goes on to explain that something could be considered illegal if it just hurts someone. And so perhaps just revealing private information would be enough to hurt someone, even if there was no demand for money to accompany it. Yeah, Nikki, that's a great point. So I think this is an example of where we have to make an inference. So B doesn't as explicitly break down the two acts and identify them as legal or illegal. But it does give us enough support to suggest that if someone were to just reveal information that's problematic or that's hurtful, that in and of itself could be unlawful. And we get that from this sentence right here. If the shame would hurt this person, the act of revelation was unlawful. And that's separate from whether there's blackmail involved or not. So it suggests that these are not each legal separately. And there was a comment in the chat, excuse me, a moment ago about looking for one that is mentioned in A but not in B. And that is, I think, a really helpful comment because it's not quite what our task is. What we're trying to decide is what can we infer based on A and B. And so if we look at an answer like answer choice B, passage A explicitly mentions the triangular structure. Passage B doesn't mention it, but it sort of seems to fit the definition of the triangular structure in that there are 3 people involved in blackmail, and we care about the third party's interests. So just because it doesn't explicitly say it, we don't really have evidence that it wouldn't be true of blackmail in that context. And the same for answer choice D. We don't have any evidence that the Romans would have a different definition of blackmail and than the US or Canada. Thank you, Tara. That's very kind. All right. So tough question. Does anybody have any lingering concerns about this one? Feel free to raise your hand if you would like to share on the microphone. All right, if not, let's do one more question. So this will be our final question. I'll give you another minute for this. All right, that's a minute and a half. I will launch one last poll. All right, so this is our toughest question yet. And that makes sense. These analogy questions are often very challenging. They also often come at the end of a reading comp passage set of questions. And that makes them great questions to skip if you are pressed for time, because people tend to have a lower rate of accuracy on these, and they also are often at the end of a set. It's really helpful to come into these questions with a decent pre-phrase, and sometimes even to write that down. So we're looking for how the way that Canadian and US common law treat Black male relates to the way that Roman law treats Black male. So coming into this, what I would think in my head is, okay, so they both have the end results of Black male is generally illegal, but they get to it in a very different method. The US has this, and Canada have this really specific category to make it illegal, whereas the Roman system has a much broader theoretical sort of underpinning to its law, and the consequence is that it's illegal, even though it isn't sort of named as such. So I'm looking for, like, they have the same end result, but they get to it in very different ways, and the one way is much more specific than the other way, which is much more broad and all-encompassing. So I'm going to walk through how I would think about the answer choices with that pre-phrase in mind. So answer choice A offers a really stark contrast. One country has the requirement, one country doesn't. I would eliminate this one on my first pass, because this is what I would expect if in one country Black male was ultimately illegal, and in the other country there were never any legal consequences for Black male. And that's not quite what this is saying. Even though the Romans didn't have a category for Black male, it was ultimately typically deemed unlawful because of its consequences. So it's a little bit missing the point of the second passage. B says one country makes it illegal to use cell phones on trains. Another makes it illegal to use cell phones on both trains and buses. Okay, I would probably keep this one in contention. They have sort of a similar end result, but one is broader. C, one country legally allows many income tax deductions and exemptions. The other allows relatively few. I would eliminate this one because the difference between the passages didn't really seem to be about quantity. It wasn't like, oh, tons of Black male is considered illegal in the US, but it very little was in Roman times. I don't think that comparison was made one way or the other. D looks promising because it's got this sort of specific criteria. In one country, it's illegal to own guns if you're a felon. The other country has sort of a broader way of making gun ownership illegal. And then the final one country makes it illegal to drive motorcycles with racing grade engines. Another country legally permits it but fines them more. So this seems pretty different than what I'm expecting, because it has two different legal outcomes, whereas like one country, it's straight up illegal for everyone. The other country just has stronger consequences. And the degree of the consequences in each of these situations wasn't really discussed. It was just, is this legal or is this not? So that brings it down to B and D. And this is a really tough call, but ultimately, and this will probably come as a surprise to many of us, D is the correct answer. D does a better job of matching this idea that a broader theoretical underpinning results in the same consequence that something is illegal. So we've got the very specific categorization: if you're a felon, you can't own guns, versus this very broad, gun ownership is illegal for everyone, which ultimately ends up in the same result, that it's illegal for felons. The difference between that and B is B has two scenarios that are very, very similar to each other, with just like a tiny little expansion for one of them. And it doesn't quite match the degree to which these two systems are different, because one has such a broader legal underpinning. Yeah, I see a lot of people responding with emotion in the chat. This is definitely a tough question. And if you wrote it off immediately, you might want to think about what your pre-phrase was and how you might modify it a little bit in the future, so that answer choice D might look more enticing to you. All right, so this is where we're going to wrap up our session. If you are interested in checking out more of our LSAT instruction, we have our roster of upcoming courses listed on our website. Again, you can try the first session of any of our classes for free. We actually don't have in-person classes right now. All of our courses are online, so there are lots of great, safe options for you to choose from. It was lovely working with y'all for the past hour, and I wish you the best of luck with your LSAT studies. Take care.